what's all that fuss really about? Pedophilia and the fake indignation of our new libertines. It's been all over the news for quite a while now, an especially Western European phenomenon. Public indignation, even outrage, in the face of pedophilia, which really amounts to the sexual manipulation of children. In fact, public outbursts of indignation are growing against all sorts of sexual liberties. Without naming anyone in particular, let us say that the standard defense mounted by the accused amounts to an appeal to a contemporary loss of the freedom that bloomed in the late 1960s. As a notorious French journalist recently put it, a few decades ago we believed that art was above morality, whereas now we believe that morality is above art, keeping in mind that the belief in question is a moral one. In our times, morality would seem to have struck back at the freedom that had risen, or claimed to have risen, above all moral codes. Is this a good thing? The accused do not think so. They blame material, historical forces. One prominent film director blames the spreading of AIDS for the eclipse of freedom, a relapse into obscurantism. They do not see any necessary link between their conception of freedom and its downfall, between libertinism and tyrannical intransigence, between moral relativism and moral absolutism. Some do, however, as they notice that libertinism is not an alternative to tyranny, but its Trojan horse. Let us spell out what this means. The late 1960s apotheosis of freedom entailed the cutting off of freedom from any moral foundation, which is to say, from the question of the public good. Freedom became libertine's idol. No sooner was freedom treated thus than it lost not merely any anchorage, but also any proper content. Freedom converted into a private sense of certainty or moral prejudice stemming from the asocial, hedonistic impulses of libertines. The libertines' defense of freedom would open the door to the assault on any social-minded conception of freedom. The apotheosis of freedom signaled the demise, even condemnation, or formal abrogation of political or properly human freedom. Indeed, the apotheosis was based upon, or made possible by, the privatization of freedom. The apotheosis entailed the transplanting of freedom from a public foundation onto a private one. Old-school libertines appear nowadays appalled at contemporary moral bigotry. They either do not see, or they pretend not to notice, that today's bigotry is none other than the coming of age of yesterday's rejection of any freedom rising above the confines of private life. Public freedom was to be replaced by the elevation of private freedom to divine-like heights, or by the universalizing of private freedom. What the libertine feels in private is now assumed to have a universal import, or to be valid for everyone. It is enough to feel that something is right in order to assume that it actually is. We do not need to reason about right, it suffices to intuit right, to sense it unreflectively. To be free is supposed to be precisely to sense without concern for reflection, to live without need for reason, to do without asking why. In a society of libertines, freedom must be shut within the confines of divine-like solitude. It must not dare rise above such confines, even as they apply to all. We are supposed to be all free, equally participating in the constitution of a world made by and reflecting our private sense of certainty. The affirmation of the sense of certainty, our very self-affirmation, as beings above good and evil, stands as a moral imperative projecting itself into a world denying any freedom above the imperative. All this brings us to see why our times are indignant, even outraged, in the face of old libertines' behavior such as pedophilia. What is at stake is not the behavior as such. Indeed, in France, public protesters sanction the consented molestation of 13-year-olds, but not that of 14-year-olds. But the very notion that freedom, or the libertine, can rise above contemporary mores. Once the selfishness of the libertine has turned into a universalized moral imperative, one is no longer allowed to rise above good and evil. What is really good is supposed to have been incarnated by the universalized morality springing from universal selfishness. The time would thus have come to reject any attempt to transcend our morality, if only in the name of art, science, or more simply, freedom. For our morality comes to coincide with the very legal projection, strict universalizing, of everyone's selfishness. This is not to say that morality is considered as static or immutable. On the contrary, it is hailed as evolving. Its rules might call for the legitimacy of a 50-year-old sexually manipulating an 18-year-old in the United States, or a 14-year-old in France, under the assumption that numbers are modifiable according to historical circumstances. Thus, tomorrow we might define pedophilia as limited to cases involving children under 9 years old, but not children over 9. The dividing line might be defined more and more by physiological capacities, such as the child's organ development. Right might be seen ever more clearly as defined by might. The real target of contemporary indignation is not pedophilia as such, but a freedom conceived as rising above our evolving morality grounded in freedom itself. Accordingly, especially abominable to our sense of justice will be the expression of freedom manifested by people appealing to or representing standards transcending our shared evolving morality. Foremost among such people seem to be priests and intellectuals or artists. To attack the clergy is especially bloodthirst quenching, not because one cares for victims of sexual predation, but insofar as one cares for the overturning of any appeal to an unevolving moral standard. The pedophile priest's primary fault is bound to his claim to represent an unchanging ground of freedom. To sanction his selfishness is to undermine his claim. Likewise, in the case of an intellectual's, writer's, or artist's pedophilia, what is troubling is not ultimately the deed, but the fact that it was executed in the name of a freedom above evolving moral conventions. Indeed, all conventions are now assumed to be evolving. Since, or to the extent that, today, our moral conventions are intuited as bringing to full fruition the libertinism of earlier decades, any pretext will be judged good for the sake of establishing our selfishness-based evolving morality as an absolute above which no one should dare rise. Libertines who feel shocked today as they see themselves defamed as monsters or ostracized from humanity itself fail to notice that they are being chastised not because of one deed or another, but because their deed was performed in defiance of moral conventions. The idea here is that such libertines set a bad example for our age, in which we must rid ourselves of anyone speaking the language of freedom above mores. The morality of freedom having been established, the old libertines' talk, not merely old priestly talk, ought to be abrogated in favor of a new libertines' talk, viewing our evolving contemporary morality as the Mecca of all freedom.